Welcome to AMIC in Edinburgh. With me now, the BBC presenter Clive Myrie. Clive, this is the year of elections taking place around the world.
Yeah.
There are a number taking place. We've seen a few already. What do you think are the primary risks that elections are bringing and how they are changing the geopolitical situation?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's great to be here at AMIC again. Yes, it's the year of elections, 64 countries with the European Union on top of that. That's another 500 million people. Factor India in there, of course, you've got billions of people actually going to the polls. And one would see that as a good thing, an amazing thing. The most votes that are going to be counted in any one year in human history. But certain leaders have been adepts at perverting the democratic process. There was an election in Russia, and there wasn't an election in Russia. We know how the media can be manipulated and so on and so forth. So it's a good moment, it's a powerful moment, showing signs of social democracy, but there are caveats that we have to add there too. And I think it's incumbent on businesses to be prepared for any scenario. Classic example is the situation with the US election, which is coming up in early November. Could it be Biden? Could it be Trump? It would be potentially 0.01% of a swing in any one of the 6 or 7 key battleground states that decide the election. So that means you cannot focus on Biden winning and you can't focus on Trump winning. You've got to be prepared. And that, I think, is my biggest level of advice, my biggest takeaway really for businesses. Be prepared for all scenarios and hope that whichever scenario does come to pass, you're prepared, and that removes uncertainty. And frankly, that's the biggest risk for businesses. It's uncertainty.
How do we mitigate against the uncertainty that exists in the electoral cycle? After all, here in the UK, for example, we've seen a complete change in the last 24 hours with the arrival of Nigel Farage on the scene.
Well, I mean, all the polls suggest and have suggested over the last year, 18 months, that perhaps the Conservatives' time in power is coming to an end. And frankly, it's simply a case of by how much will the Labour Party win the poll on July the 4th. I think the influence of Nigel Farage will, in the eyes of some observers, make it a little more likely that the Labour victory could be beyond 50, 60, 70 seats, rather than perhaps 10, 20 seats. I don't think it's going to change what the polls are suggesting will be the result itself. I think what it might do, because of course Reform UK will potentially split the vote in some areas, and they're fielding candidates in all the constituencies. I think the suggestion is that it'll simply make it more difficult for the Conservatives to be competitive.
Looking back a little bit at your career, you've been a foreign correspondent across Europe, in Africa too. Mm-hmm. Tell me about some of the trends that you've seen, that you've witnessed, that have helped to either create situations of stability or instability.
I think, particularly as we're speaking on the day after a female president has been elected to Mexico for the first time, I think the influence of what was referred to in the 50s and 60s during the Cold War as the non-aligned movement, now we call them the Global South. The countries that are not necessarily on their own carrying the kind of weight and punch that would influence the policies of an America or China or a Russia, but collectively carry clout because of their influence globally, economically, but also in the United Nations with their votes. That rise of that sort of non-aligned, newly reconstituted non-aligned movement has been something that's been really, really interesting. And we're seeing their influence, for instance, on the debate over Israel's war in Gaza. We're seeing it in the debate over Russia's war in Ukraine. And we could increasingly see it come to be influential in other controversial scenarios around the world. If there is a move by China towards Taiwan, for instance, where would that leave countries like Mexico, Brazil, South Africa? How would they feel about that kind of intervention? So that's something that I've seen over the last few years, particularly as I covered the last election in Mexico a few years ago.
So, given your experience, what kind of advice would you give to risk professionals to look towards managing that risk in the long term?
Be prepared for all scenarios. I mean, I've just chaired a fantastic discussion with some experts in risk management, experts in domestic and global politics, and a former chief at NATO, where the overriding advice is be prepared for anything. That is exhausting. It can be expensive, but it is the best way to insure yourself against what could be coming down the track. Be prepared for anything, and get all your ducks in a row. And that means you're gonna be, as I say, spending money. You're gonna be perhaps putting resources into areas that you might feel are unnecessary because you think one outcome is more likelier than another, but be prepared for everything. I mean, I wonder how many businesses genuinely prepared for the possibility of Brexit.